Happy Earth Day, everyone. Really pleased you are joining us today. Is a big day for environmental actions locally, nationally, and internationally, and it means a lot that you are here with us. I'm Elizabeth Henry, president of the Environmental League of Massachusetts. ELM is a 122-year-old environmental advocacy organization based on Beacon Hill. We have been pushing for Massachusetts to lead the nation in responsible environmental policy since 1898. And I'm really delighted to welcome our nearly 250 registrants joining us by Zoom and those that are watching us on Facebook Live. You include policymakers, business people, environmental advocates, social justice leaders, parents, grandparents, teachers, and students. And we're pleased to have so many employees of our ELM Corporate Council members joining us today. So welcome to ELM's Earth Month webinar series called Climate And. In these 4 sessions, we've been discussing intersectional climate issues with a diverse array of thought leaders. We're exploring how Massachusetts can fight the climate crisis while building a healthy, green, just, and prosperous future for the people of the Commonwealth. So if you missed the previous webinars on climate and health, climate and clean energy, and climate and equity, they're available to view on ELM's YouTube and Facebook pages, and a colleague has just dropped the link in the chat. So today in our final session, we're going to dive into climate and economy with our moderator, Bethany Patten, who's our ELM board treasurer and lecturer and senior associate director of the Sustainability Initiative at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Our panelists are Secretary Mike Keneally, the Massachusetts Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, Lauren Jones, the EVP at the Massachusetts Business Roundtable, and Ivan Frischberg, Director of Impact Policy for Amalgamated Bank and the Amalgamated Charitable Foundation. You can submit questions for the panelists in the Q&A box and give a thumbs up to the questions that you most want to hear answered. This webinar will also be recorded, captioned, and made available on ELM's YouTube channel following the session. This panel is made possible through the generous support of ELM Corporate Council member Amalgamated Bank, and I have the real privilege of turning it over to Amalgamated's Senior VP and New England Regional Market Director, Mark Walsh. But before I do, I just have to say, Mark, I have really appreciated how Amalgamated Bank has been uncommonly committed to environmental advocacy, and we're grateful that you're using your voice on Beacon Hill. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I want to thank you and the entire team at ELM. Whether you're advocating on Beacon Hill or putting events like today's event together, your work has been incredible in that it's important and it's impactful on the environmental issues we are all concerned about. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to sponsor the event today and also just to be a member of the ELM's Corporate Council. I got to say, I think it's worth every cent. And if folks online are not members, I would urge them to consider joining the council because their contribution is incredibly important. I also just want to personally thank the moderator and the panelists. We appreciate your time and your insights today. Now, I'm going to guess there's probably a few folks who haven't heard of Amalgamated, and you're saying to yourself, what the hell is Amalgamated Bank? I've never heard of them. So I just want to take a brief minute to tell a little bit about us. Amalgamated was started back in 1923 in New York City by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union of America to support working immigrant families. Over the last 100 years, we've grown to be the largest B Corp bank in the country. We're a mission-driven, full-service commercial bank with offices in New York, DC, San Francisco, and as of last July, Boston. As America's socially responsible bank, our mission is to empower organizations that work to advance positive social change. Our primary focus is working with nonprofits, foundations, political organizations, labor unions, and for-profit enterprises that are active, involved, and committed to make our communities stronger, safer, fairer, and cleaner. When it comes to fighting climate change, Amalgamated has been leading the way in the banking industry. To us, that means that since 2016, we don't invest in or lend to fossil fuel companies. And I might add that we don't invest or lend to gun manufacturers, payday lenders, organizations that impede workers' rights. It also means that we're 100% committed to renewable energy and currently are net zero emissions in our operations. We were the first US bank to commit to measuring, reporting, and reducing finance carbon emissions and to aligning our lending with the Paris Agreement on climate change. And just yesterday, Amalgamated Bank played a leadership role in the formation of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, announced yesterday by the White House by Mark Carney, former Secretary John Kerry, and Treasury Secretary Yellen. We're one of only 4 banks to sign up to launch this event, and we're part of a small group of banks globally who lead the organization of this alliance. I couldn't be happier to have Ivan Fishberg, Amalgamated's Director of Impact Policy, on the panel today. Ivan has led this work and is a driving force in climate change, fighting climate change, and using climate finance as a tool to do that. So with that, I just want to turn it over to our moderator, Bethany Patten.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much for Amalgamated for sponsoring this. And thank you to Elizabeth and ELM for your leadership. I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel today, and especially on a topic that I spend so much time thinking about, the intersection of climate change and the economy. Today, you'll hear from both the public and private sectors on ways that we can lift all boats while also avoid a rising tide. So we're going to begin with some prepared questions for our panelists, and then we've reserved some time at the end for audience questions. So please use the Q&A box, and let's get going. I'm going to start with Secretary Keneally. Secretary, just before the pandemic, the administration released its 5-year economic development plan, Partnerships for Growth, that has environment as a foundational principle and builds on years of work around resiliency, adaptation, and renewable energy by Governor Baker and the legislature. Just a few weeks ago, Governor Baker signed a sweeping climate bill, the Next Generation Roadmap Bill, that commits the state to reducing economy-wide emissions 50% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. How do these two plans work together to support environmental, economic, and equity objectives?
Well, thank you, Bethany, and thank you, Elizabeth and ELM, for hosting this this really important series. Great to be with you all today. It's a great question, and just by way of background, it's state law that requires every new term of a governor to come up with a new economic development plan for the Commonwealth. And so we spent the bulk of 2019 traveling the state, getting lots of input about what our economic development strategy should look like. And we settled on what we call 4 pillars and 5 principles. The 4 pillars of the plan are respond to the housing crisis. We'll talk some more about that in a little bit. Build vibrant communities, support business competitiveness, and train a skilled workforce. And I would say those remain our objectives now. Those are our objectives pre-pandemic, and they are largely the same post-pandemic, though with some renewed urgency and some differences and points of emphasis now that we're in a very different environment. And there were really 5 main principles that inform the work as well. Having regional strategies, recognizing the Commonwealth is made up of many diverse regions and 351 cities and towns, accessible government, equitable opportunity, infrastructure, and of course the environment, as you mentioned. Now, since we've adopted the plan at the end of 2019 and had an economic development bill passed by the legislature, signed by the governor in January of this year, obviously now there's been a new climate bill this year as well, which I think is going to really be the foundation for some bold and equitable and aggressive action to protect our economy and our most vulnerable residents. So there's a lot going on here, both in terms of economic development strategy and climate strategy. Your question is how do they work together? I'd say they have to work together because we really have to achieve both objectives. You think about, I touched on the housing crisis, for example. We've been using that term for quite some time in our administration, long before we ever knew what COVID-19 was. We simply have to build a lot more housing around the state. We've had a housing affordability crisis and availability crisis for a very, very long time now. And so as you think about developing housing, we need to make sure that we're building a lot more housing and doing so in a climate sensible way. There's a lot we need to do here in terms of our economy and our housing, and a lot of opportunity as well. And so, for example, we'll think about, how do we make investments in green energy production like offshore wind, energy efficiency, energy storage, sustainable forestry, some exciting areas there. How do we make regionally targeted investments in key industry clusters that can further our economic and our climate objectives? How do we make sure climate change mitigation strategies are considered in all of our economic development grant awards? So it really will be a very focused effort to make sure we're furthering the goals of both our economic development plan and our climate objectives at the same time.
Fantastic. I'm going to go to Lauren, and I'm going to ask you, Lauren, your organization includes the CEOs and senior executives from some of the state's largest employers. What do you hear from your members on climate as it relates to the state's economy?
Thank you, Bethany, and again, thank you to the ELM team for the opportunity to join and to celebrate Earth Day as well. So as mentioned, the Massachusetts Business Roundtable is comprised of CEOs and senior executives representing industries across the state. We actually come together really with a focus on policy solutions with the goal of strengthening the state's economy and our competitiveness. So we're very policy driven. And with that, we look at policy ranging from energy and environment, but also workforce development and education, housing, transportation and infrastructure, healthcare, and also some intersecting areas like diversity, equity, and inclusion, competitiveness, and innovation business practices. And so I think while we look at all these areas, we find that it's important that we thread a sense of guiding principles through all this work. And I share all this context to help explain the question you were asking, but the guiding principles include opportunity, equity, and competitiveness. So at the end of the day, realizing the opportunity that we have to reimagine how we're doing business, equity to ensure that we're reaching all populations, and competitiveness so that we are staying number one, especially in clean tech and energy efficiency and all the other innovative ways that we're strong in the Commonwealth. But I share that for context because as it relates to climate, in a nutshell, the Roundtable with this guiding principle around opportunity, equity, and competitiveness supports public policy and regulatory efforts that really help to provide that reliable, sustainable, and affordable energy resource for both consumers and businesses. And by doing so, we believe that maintaining this approach will help us with a growing economy and touching on all the other intersecting areas like workforce development and building out the jobs of the future, and doing so in the most cost-efficient way while addressing climate change. So there's many different things moving at once, but I think whether you're looking at clean tech innovation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, investing in resiliency, planning, our members see this as a business imperative. Clean energy initiatives bring down the cost of energy for employers while also moving to a more cleaner and sustainable future, which is important. We also know that Massachusetts is a top state for innovation. I mentioned some of our number ones, and we want to maintain that. And it's important that we do, even in these current times, as well as we think about our post-pandemic recovery. And to the Secretary's point, there's some things that we are double downing on or putting a greater exclamation mark on as we think about our recovery. And I think a big part of that is jobs. And as we look at building on the success of the clean energy sector in the Commonwealth and the opportunity that is promising when you look at emerging areas like offshore wind and the opportunity to build that pipeline for future workforce. So we are very much excited to build on our strengths, to invest in more areas that create this right balance, and look forward to talking more about how this all helps to support a stronger and more competitive Massachusetts.
Fantastic. And I like how you sort of connected the public and private the public and private made that public and private connection. And then because the reason I like that is because that takes us to the next leg of the stool, which is the investment stool. You know, certainly anything that you guys are doing at the Business Roundtable is going to require the public sector and citizens and community members to get on board. It's also going to require a lot of support from policy. And of course, you're going to need the investment side. So I'm going to turn it over to Ivan. And Ivan, Amalgamated Bank is not a brand that's familiar to most of our Massachusetts audience. Can you give us some context on how Amalgamated gained its national climate leadership role and international influence in climate finance?
Thanks, Bethany, and thank you everybody from the ELM team, Secretary Kinley and Lawrence. Great to be with you all today. Yeah, it's a funny thing. We're a $6 billion bank, so it's equivalent to kind of a good-sized regional bank, but we have a national footprint, and Mark outlined the kind of clients that we have, but it's not who you would think would be at the forefront of some of these sort of global climate finance initiatives. And it really comes down to our legacy as a mission aligned and socially responsible bank is not just to do banking in the way that we think it should be done, but also to kind of lead and use our position as a bank to change the world around us. And that extends from everything to the wages that we pay our employees. And we've led on living wage issues as a bank and tried to push the financial sector in that regard. And we've certainly done that on climate. We, over the last few years, have built a coalition of financial institutions now at $29 trillion of assets behind them to come behind a single standard for measuring financed emissions. So today, the White House is releasing executive orders talking about how to require more disclosure from companies and financial institutions on the climate risks that they face and about the impact that they have. And a part of that is a standardized methodology for measuring financed emissions. So we've helped to lead that effort globally. And as you mentioned, that the White House is gathering. They have announced a Glasgow Finance Alliance for net zero, which includes a net zero banking alliance. And again, that's a place where we helped to kind of lead and initiate that alliance and structured it. And we did it as a much smaller partner than the other banks, but we did it because we thought it was important. It was important it was done right, and that's part of the influence that we have in the world around us. That is now announced yesterday with $28.5 trillion of assets from the banking sector. A quarter of all U.S. bank assets are included in that, but it's really just 4 banks. It's Amalgamated, Citi, Bank of America, and our good friends at Morgan Stanley. So the reason I think then to kind of transition to how this connects to the real economy and the work that's being done on the ground in Massachusetts, it is. There's a theory that, and has been very clearly articulated, we don't have enough finance in the public sector to solve these problems, to either adapt, mitigate, or provide the resilience that we need for what's happening on climate change. And so it is going to take trillions and trillions of dollars. And that capital really only exists in the private sector. But you can't get that capital to move into the right places without the combination of both real economy policy regulation and financial regulation. And so it really is about putting all of those things together to make sure that we hit our climate goals and our economic goals. And the work that we've been doing on the finance side is to really kind of organize finance collectively around the same set of goals, the same set of rules, so that it is much clearer from the real economy side and from the policy sector side, how capital can be mobilized, how it can be moved, and that we really truly are sort of partners for rebuilding this new economy. We have been doing a lot of that work at the bank and sort of our day-to-day banking work. Now, 23% of our loan portfolio is directed towards climate solutions. We do it through our asset management business, engaging with companies. We've been now pushing companies for 4 years to set and report to net zero targets. And we do it through the kind of policy advocacy and the initiatives that I just mentioned. But our goal is really to sort of build clarity on the climate finance side so that we can be better partners with the real economy and with policymakers.
Great. And so I actually think this is a good transition into some of the bigger investments that can, both the public, private, and private investments that can be made here in Massachusetts. And I want to go back to Lauren's comment about staying number one and thinking a little bit about offshore wind. Because I see offshore wind as being the one thing that really brings all 3 of you together. So every year, Massachusetts businesses and residents spend about $22 billion dollars on energy, and about 18 billion of that leaves the state. Imagining what that money could do if it was reinvested in our local economy. Offshore wind is an opportunity that I know all of us have been tracking and even directly working on, and is likely to play an outsized role in our state's clean energy future. Secretary, from your perspective, where is the potential for our economy in this new sector?
Thanks, Bethany. I think there's tremendous potential, and it's exciting to think about a new sector of the innovation economy with the state has some natural leadership positions. So, for example, we're home to the only purpose-built offshore wind port in the nation, the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. We're also home to the largest wind blade testing facility in North America in Charlestown. We've done a kind of comprehensive ports and infrastructure analysis to assess 19 different sites that could be utilized in Massachusetts. We've got a lot going on here in terms of the basic infrastructure assets for offshore wind, coupled with our natural and ongoing investments generally in the innovation economy. I'll say a couple other things. With respect to workforce, we've had now a dedicated workforce development strategy. I serve as part of our workforce skills cabinet, Secretaries of Economic Development, Labor, and Education. And we've been doing this work for a long time now, addressing skills gaps and skills opportunities around the state. And workforce training programs in offshore wind, I think, have particular potential in that regard. Bristol Community College, for example, has launched an offshore wind energy program with with help from one of our skills capital grants. And so it's exciting to think about a sort of bold, new, exciting sector of the innovation economy, one where we have some natural assets and advantages, and one where we can help develop the workforce of today and tomorrow. I mentioned as part of our plan, one of the overriding objectives is equity. And so it's worth noting that in the recent RFP in offshore wind, we're requiring bidders to submit diversity, equity, and inclusion plans, including a workforce diversity plan and a supplier diversity plan. So as we can further both our climate objectives, our economic objectives, we can do so in a way that promotes equity as well.
Yeah, and I'm really impressed, especially with the communities of New Bedford who are stepping up in ways that are just like really taking leadership roles in this new. Lauren, what are your members saying about offshore wind? How are they, how are they getting involved?
Well, as the roundtable as a whole, we see this as an opportunity. You've mentioned some of the assets already. 1,500 miles of coast right here in Massachusetts, along the eastern seaboard. But also, I think when you look at the promise of jobs that can come from this, building off of what Secretary Keneally said, we've seen overall in clean energy job growth in the last decade. When you look at what areas are more emerging, we know that offshore wind has that trajectory. They've already seen some growth even in the last year when you look at some of the recent reports that have come out in comparing jobs in specifically for offshore wind. And so we see this as an opportunity. And I think this is where it intersects a policy area like energy and environment, or more specifically the opportunity with offshore wind, with other policy areas like education, workforce development. And so I think as a whole, our roundtable members think that we need to be planning today for our future. And in order to really build on this momentum and the opportunity for investing in offshore wind, we need to think about where those jobs are today and what we can be doing to build a pipeline. And I think that there are some emerging areas where we've been able to invest, and I say we, the Commonwealth, has been able to invest in jobs like in tech and advanced manufacturing and healthcare. But if there's an opportunity to find what those in-demand roles are for offshore wind or clean energy as a whole, then we can also be building that pipeline today to then help sustain for the future, and I think also help in job placement for job seekers that are looking for new opportunities.
Yeah, and long-term opportunities for sure.
Exactly.
Ivan, when you're with your kind of national hat on, but thinking about Massachusetts as potentially being, a leader in this regard, there's certainly other states who are considering building offshore wind. There's definitely some competitiveness. Do you have a perspective at all? I'm kind of putting you on the spot a little bit, but I'm guessing that you have a perspective. Do you have a perspective on how Massachusetts could really lead when it comes to offshore wind?
Massachusetts is used to leading on a lot of things. I think there's now 49 other states that think they're the biotech state, that's going to lead. And we all know that Massachusetts has been leading on these things for a long time. And I've been around long enough to remember when the Filthy Five campaign started, not when it ended. And a lot of the leadership around clean energy and the opportunity in Massachusetts has come from a tradition of policy leadership, right? Clean energy standards, the sorts of things that we're thinking about now nationally. And I think that is that presents itself from things like the kind of offshore wind opportunity to folks like Sunwealth who are doing incredible work. All of these are influenced by both state policy, but also federal policy around tax credits. So, and particularly around whether we kind of continue and expand those tax credits to include grants for smaller development, particularly the kind of development that is going to contribute more to some of the equity goals that we are concerned with. So I think there's tremendous opportunity here to kind of flip the switch from where it's been about sort of shutting down the filthy five, about cleaning up our act, to really kind of finding the opportunity and the alliance around jobs, the economy, and clean energy. And so I don't think Massachusetts has to worry about too much about sort of the leadership position, because it really has been in a leadership role for so long. And I can't resist but add thank you for Gina McCarthy, right? Is sort of a classic example of the kind of leadership and the things that Massachusetts has delivered for the country as a model.
Can I just jump in real quick, because I love all this talk about our being number one in things, because we talk about that a lot in this office as well. We do lead in so many sectors of the innovation economy. Life sciences, we are the clear global leader in that one. I'll argue that one all day long. Technology, advanced manufacturing, lots of other areas. And we do that because we've had, I think, a very established playbook and strategy for a long time, which is collaboration between government, business, academia, our great research centers around the state. So it's we kind of know what we're doing in that regard. There's a reason why we lead in these areas, and a lot of it comes down to, I think, some very important natural advantages in innovation, but also a real spirit of collaboration that makes a lot of these great things happen.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit and just get into a little bit of a talk about infrastructure, because infrastructure is certainly, and obviously offshore winds is definitely a piece of infrastructure, but there's a lot more going on right now at the national level when it comes to investing in infrastructure. And specifically around, Secretary, you talked about the housing crisis and how we can support the housing crisis and sort of, reverse that trend. We know also that buildings are, a huge contributor to greenhouse gases. How is the state thinking about just that intersection of, building affordable housing, ensuring that it's efficient, and, building it at a cost that's reasonable for everyone in the long run, and then possibly, if there is some kind of connection back to the big federal initiatives around infrastructure development?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Bethany. Let me say a few things. When I talked about the housing crisis, I think a lot of people don't quite realize how bad the situation is, to put it in plain terms. And so, for perspective, from 1960 to 1990, the state built about 900,000 new housing units. And from 1990 till 2020, a similar 30-year period, that number was about 440,000. And so our level of housing production literally was cut in half in a single generation, at a time when our economy grew and our population grew, and supply and demand being what it is, we had rising demand and falling supply. We've had some of the fastest growing, probably the fastest growing home values and rents of any state in the country. And we look at things like vacancy rates, both for home ownership and rental properties. Those are fractions of what they ought to be for stable vacancy rates. We look at the degree to which our citizens are cost burdened by housing, which is, if you're paying 30% or more of your income on housing, your cost burden, that's about half our citizens. Shockingly, about a quarter of our citizens pay more than 50% of their income on housing. So this is a really, and like I said, we've been calling this the housing crisis for a very long time now. It's a real threat to our communities, our citizens, and our business competitiveness. We're trying to address that in a few different ways. One is by direct investments in the affordable housing ecosystem. We've invested about $1.4 billion to create 20,000 affordable units since the start of the Baker-Polito administration. We managed to get done this year the most significant zoning reform in about 50 years to make it easier to rezone properties at the local level for housing. We have a very dedicated effort around transit-oriented development, which, by the way, I think is smart housing policy, smart transit policy, and smart climate policy, getting more housing near public transit. So we're doing a lot in that regard. I'll say one thing: as we think about goals around net zero emissions and net zero buildings, I do think we have to be mindful of the impacts on builders and consumers, and really make sure we understand sort of the art of the possible, what's happening on the ground as we go through that. And a lot of that can be solved by technology. Again, that great spirit and advantages we have in innovation, making sure the innovation can help make that happen. But we got to be mindful of that for sure, because we do have very aggressive housing production goals that we need to meet. We are doing a number of things now to make sure that we're building in the most sustainable way possible. So our Department of Housing and Community Development, which drives all of our investments in affordable housing, they've had sustainable design principles now in their work for quite some time. In their conversations with hundreds of developers every year, there are questions about, how will projects be designed in a way that promotes, green, sustainable, climate resilient design. That's an important part of their dialogue in terms of what projects they fund. It's also part of their dialogue with local housing authorities about our public housing infrastructure. And then in the economic development bill I mentioned, we do have new capital resources specifically to build climate resilient, affordable housing. And I guess the last thing I'll mention in that regard is something that was announced just yesterday, which is this climate resilience design standards tool, which will be used now for folks building housing and creating other projects around the state. I think it's going to be a very helpful tool so we can understand the climate impacts of development of all kinds.
Fantastic. And Lauren, do you feel like your community is sort of stepping up in this resiliency effort, and just sort of supporting this and the state's goal, the state's goal? So the secretary talked a little bit about talking to builders and and talking to developers. Are you hearing that same level of support from your members?
I think I'll take that in a couple of ways. I think one, we as a roundtable need to strike a balance. And we realize this as our members come together to strike a balance between leading with innovation, but then also thinking about the affordability and how that may impact, say if it's in the development arena. That said, I think as a whole, we know that in order for us to consider resiliency planning and our future, a more sustainable future, we have to consider it as a business imperative and recognize that in order for the Commonwealth to stay on its path towards the goals that the Secretary has referenced, we need to think about how to do so in innovative ways and hopefully lean more innovative solutions while trying to recognize there are some cost implications as well.
Absolutely. And then, oh, go ahead, Ivan.
Yeah, Bethany, if I could, I mean, this is, I think, the perfect example of how we meet society's needs with respect to housing and how we're going to have to harness the interaction between private finance and public sector policy. We almost a quarter of our portfolio, our loan book, goes into workforce housing, right? This is a huge piece of what we do. We have set ambitious targets to be net zero by 2050. That means, 50% cut by 2030. That a lot of that can come through improvements in the grid and just cleaning up the emissions factor of the electricity. But ultimately, we can't on our own get to net zero in 2050 in the housing sector if we are not building fully net zero ready homes from this point on. Right, we don't have the opportunity to go to clients once a multifamily property or home's built and say, okay, now you got to switch this, and here's how we're going to finance it. That's not going to work. And so we have to be able to hit these longer term targets. We need sort of private capital and the real economy and policy to come together to say, how do we do these things right now so that they're going to be right 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now. And I think that's the real partnership that a lot of these finance alliances are getting to.
When you say we need to have this alliance, do you think there's a barrier to that right now?
I think I sit in Washington, D.C. We have a requirement that as of, I think, a couple of years, no new build with, that isn't fully electric and assuming fully clean grid. I think, Massachusetts is a similar leader in this space, but I don't think that's Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. and New York City are fully, exemplify where the rest of the country is. And so I think in many ways, we're trying to build that leadership collectively and sort of spread it out. I do think having the larger financial institutions start to get on board with this, even sometimes kicking and dragging. But it makes a difference because our exposure to real estate is not the same as Bank of America's, right? Both in scale and in sort of geography. And so I think them making these sorts of commitments starts to take the leadership that we have here and sort of export it to more places around the country.
And do you, Secretary, feel like we have an opportunity, like at your level, feel like we have an opportunity to export it? Is there, forums for you to be able to share with other states what we're doing here?
I'm sure there are. It's probably more my counterpart in the cabinet, Secretary Theo Harides. I always struggle with her name. Secretary Katie, my great colleague in the cabinet, who spends a lot of time on these policy objectives directly. And the comment on housing, I think, is an important one. I think we do need to. We have housing production goals, we have climate goals, and making sure those are aligned, and making sure that we're having the kind of technology development that, for example, will make net zero buildings, particularly multifamily housing, cost feasible in the future as well.
Yeah. I want to just switch a little bit because we've had a lot of questions about equity and we touched on it a little bit, but I think it's probably good for us to talk a little bit more about it. Lauren, as companies in all levels of government are thinking about thinking big about how to address climate change while supporting our economy, how do you think we can ensure that equity is centered on this work? And how do we focus on the involvement and inclusion of Black and working class people to have a green and just transition?
That's a big question, and I'll try to be brief because I feel like you can answer that in many different ways, and probably take a whole another hour to talk through. I think at the center of this is ensuring equity as you think about any policy, but I think specifically understanding that we know there's health disparities when it comes to communities of color. We know that there's health disparities and inequities in certain neighborhoods. If you look into certain neighborhoods within cities along the seacoast that we have, or in other areas that may have more vulnerability. So I think trying to think of policy solutions to ensure equity, and not just thinking about all things equal, but really trying to ensure that we are creating greater resources for those that are most impacted and most vulnerable. And I think that as it relates to health, it dovetails with the strength of our economy, because we need to ensure that there is an opportunity for all to thrive, residents as well as businesses. But I think if we're starting off with inequity, then you're going to not allow that opportunity for everyone to participate and to be able to have that access and opportunity. So I think at the trying to create that level playing field, but then also ensuring that those who may need more resources are provided, I think is really important as we think about ensuring equity in this space.
And do you find that this is a subject that is top of mind with your members?
Most definitely. I think in the last year, certainly companies across industries, large and small, have reflected on what they can do or do better in reaching diversity, equity, inclusion goals. Some building on some great things they've been doing for years. I think some enhancing in that way and some just getting started. But I think coming together as a membership, we're talking about these issues and learning from each other, our companies learning from one another, and thinking about how the business community can hold themselves accountable, and also gain best practices for what employers are doing, what communities are doing, and how employers can be more active players within the community to help solve for some of these inequities that we're talking about. Great.
So let's see, I'm just going to take a look. We're moving now to the portion of the live submitted questions. So I'm just going to take a quick look and see what's there. while I'm doing that, I thought it might be useful for us to talk a little bit more about workforce development. I mean, we touched on Bristol Community College and some of these other efforts in the state to think about workforce development, and also some of the skills that are going to be needed in order to build out our our wind infrastructure and other infrastructure take a long time to develop. So how are you, and I'm not sure if this is Lauren or the secretary who would answer this, but how are you guys thinking about that kind of long lead time for training, and also, like sort of more immediate needs, especially as, the federal government is just releasing a new, the sort of more aggressive plan for net zero. The state just released their plan. Do you think there's going to be a gap? Do you think we're going to need to fill that? How are you thinking about that?
If I can jump in, I think there will be a gap, and we are trying to fill it. I mentioned this workforce skills cabinet we have for some time. So we've been doing this work now for over 6 years, really trying to assess on a regional basis, by industry and by job type, where there are skills gaps and where there's a need for a greater talent pipeline. And obviously that work has kind of different urgency now. If we started doing that work when unemployment was below 4%, then it got below 3%, and now it's around 7% after spiking it around 16% over the summer. So we're still very mindful of the need that, one, we got to get a lot of people back to work, and secondly, in some of the really promising high demand areas of our economy, there's still a need to develop a lot more talent. We work very closely with our vocational and technical high schools, our community colleges, our higher ed system, and you have to just get very specific around industry, job type. What are the credentials or skills you need? Who can supply those, and try to create that alignment, and working very actively with the business community on a whole set of initiatives there. I do want to, if I could, build on Lauren's comments around equity. I spent a lot of time with Lauren and her colleagues at the Business Roundtable and other business groups around the state. There's an incredible focus on equity now across our entire business community, and a lot of great leadership being shown by the Roundtable and other groups.
Thank you.
If I could just connect again also the equity conversation with this workforce conversation, because I think right behind systemic racism that still exists in our country, that the real driver of inequity is the kind of wealth gap that we have. And central to that is, the ability for people to earn a living, and increasingly in the affordability strains that we all face, particularly in sort of high cost markets that we're in. And that's where I think it comes down to, for us, I think we look at organized labor and unions as being a key solution here. I think it not only provides the real solutions on the equity side, but if you look at workforce development and trades and apprenticeships and the industries, if you look at sort of the wind opportunity in Massachusetts, and you kind of go, if we're investing in union jobs there, those unions are going to invest in trade development and apprenticeships and building a workforce, and we're going to pay wages that people are going to want to come into those sectors and work at. And so I think all of these things are quite connected, but it is, diversity, equity, inclusion can't be divorced from these workforce issues, because they really are, and these wealth issues, because I think they're inherently tied together.
Oh, I think this is, if there's, let me just check if there's anybody. Lauren, did you want to say something?
I was just going to build on Ivan's point around, I think just kind of connecting the two between workforce development and equity. I think that the opportunities for high-paying roles within clean tech is something that we really need to lean in more on, because of the pathways that it will provide for high-paying jobs, and linking them to individuals that may be untapped. And a lot of those individuals may be underrepresented in our industry today, but could be in the classroom and sparking interest in STEM to then have that long-term pathway, just as well as the unemployed today who may be underrepresented in this industry, but then could get on the right career pathway to gain those skills, whether it's through apprenticeship or other ways, and have that economic mobility, and to create opportunities to move in the ladder and hopefully reach that sustainability in wealth as well.
So I'm just noticing that we are at time. And I just want to close by saying, first of all, through this discussion, what I've really learned, it's going to take all of us to ensure that Massachusetts has leadership in both climate as well as ensuring that we have a sound and just recovery from the pandemic, as well as that we're looking forward to how we can, be leaders in reversing the most harmful effects of the climate crisis. I want to thank Secretary Keneally, Lauren, Ivan. Your thoughts are super valuable, and I hope we get a chance to talk again. So thank you for joining us, and thank you everybody who's listened today. As a reminder, with this, the recording of this webinar will be available on ELM's YouTube page. So please share it with your networks. And thank you all, and be well.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
great day,
you.
everybody.
Great to be with you. Thank you.